Hi, Andy Revkin here. Please give a listen to this interview I did with Mike Hulme, a longtime climate researcher and climate policy researcher at Cambridge University. We had this conversation in July 2023, but it has never been more relevant.
I've known Mike for a couple of decades through all the work I've put in as a climate journalist, climate-focused journalist, and he's written very important books through the years and been a great voice for a rational deconstruction of what's happening in the climate, what's happening in the social climate, and how we relate to this issue politically and in terms of our everyday activities. His new book is called Climate Change Isn't Everything, Polity Books, provocative headline for sure. And thank you, Mike, for taking time to do this show. It's been a long time since you were on the last time where we were talking about trust and climate science. So first of all, how are you? Are you not too hot?
Yeah, not too hot, not too cold. It's a very pleasant day here in Cambridge. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Not too hot, not too cold. Just nice.
Right. That there's that. Actually, the average temperature of the planet is about 62 degrees right now, if you average from the poles to the equator and everywhere, which is sort of an equitable position to be in. I once calculated in the United States, San Diego kind of has the Goldilocks climate. It has the fewest heating days and cooling days. So you could look at the Earth right now and say, oh, we're right at that optimal Goldilocks moment. But so what's going on? What's your, just let's start with today. You know, we've had these headlines. We know that Earth, the average temperature of the planet is warming because of us, and is now warmer than it has been since civilization began. So what's your read on the way this is being interpreted?
Well, just going back to the averages, of course, averages tell us everything that we need to know except what's important. And it's true with climate as well. We don't live in an average climate. We live as human beings, as sentient beings. We live day to day in particular places, in particular ways, with particular technologies. And this sort of actually gets to part of my argument in the book about whether actually something like global temperature, or a target for trying to limit global temperature to a particular level, is really the best or the most helpful way of thinking about our relationship with climate, both the influences that we do have on climate, and there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that humanity collectively, we have had and are continuing to have significant impacts on the climate. But also averages, in terms of what actually our goals should be when thinking about trying to mitigate the most dangerous aspects of climate change. Averages, and as I said, they can tell us, I mean, they're very useful things, they're very useful ways of summarizing, but they hide an awful lot. And as you say, you can look at 62 degrees Fahrenheit and think, well, how wonderful. But as a global average, that's not really what we're interested in. And part of my argument is that 1.5 degrees of warming or 2 degrees of warming, whatever target we set, actually doesn't get to the heart of why we're concerned about a changing climate. So I think that's one good entry point into the sort of argument here that I'm advancing.
And and let's go back through your history a little bit, just briefly, and then get to this point. You've been involved, including in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process, for a very long time. And your background is in geography, which I have found, if I could have kind of recast how I focused on this issue as a journalist a long time ago, I would have paid a lot more attention to geographers and historians, along with climate scientists. I was sucked into the story as a climate science story, and I think a lot of journalists have been and still are. And I think we think of it without that geographic context. So just tell people a little bit about your lens on this and why that helps us open our minds a little more.
Yeah, so I certainly trade under the geography banner, have done for 10 or 15 years now. And I trained as a geographer, as an undergraduate and a postgraduate student. I did my PhD in geography, looking actually at the relationship between climate variability, rainfall variability, and human societies in Northeast Africa, in Sudan, just in the Nile Valley. That was where I did my PhD. I did take a detour of maybe 10 or 15 years in the 90s and early 2000s into what was called here environmental science school. And actually, I rather lost sight of my geographical instincts or perspectives on climate. And this is sort of part of my story. I dived deep into the data, the climate data, worked with meteorologists, with climate modelers. We compared how well models were doing relative to observed climate. We looked at some of the scenarios of future global warming coming out of the models. We compared the observed data with the model data and tried to craft scenarios of future climate that could be useful for public and private policy planning. But then I came back into into geography as a disciplinary environment, and trying to recapture this more, what I would argue is a more holistic way of understanding the relationship between climate and society, between the vicissitudes and the variabilities of day-to-day weather, including the extremes, and how human societies over the years, the centuries, and of course today around the world, try to extract the benefits of their climate and mitigate against the dangers of their climate. And that, for me, is a geographical question, because it requires you to go beyond just scientific data and understand something about human values, about human technology, about politics, about the conflicts that societies have about ends and means of achieving those ends. All of those things are really right at the very center of this question about climate change. How do we live with a changing climate? How do we minimize the extent of a changing climate? And those are questions that geographers are very well placed to tackle.
What you're describing is something that, again, I migrated to more and more, which is thinking about this as an issue of climate risk more than climate change. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's a good framing. And risk itself is a malleable idea that doesn't just mean one thing. And people in risk studies, one can move across that whole realm of risk analysis from thinking that one can determine objectively what risks are, to the other extreme of actually realizing that in the end, risk is entirely constructed in the human imagination as much as anything. Now, I'm not saying either of those ends of the extreme are particularly helpful, but risk is a useful way of what it brings. It brings into play both scientific evidence, and it brings into play human and social vulnerability, and it brings into play the human imagination, and this idea of perception. So I think, risk framing is certainly one way in which I don't think I started off thinking about climate change in risk terms, but I certainly grew into this way of thinking about it in the 2000s.
Yeah, well, me too. Perhaps more recently than that, especially through the work of folks like Diana Liverman and your books too. And as I migrated more into also writing about other kinds of disasters, earthquake risk, the same formula kept coming forward. Risk exists because there's a hazard, there's exposure, and there's some level of vulnerability or the opposite, at least in one way of describing it. And that gives you levers to work at. And it also helps identify misperceived risk. You can have more risk for some particular community in a changing climate or in a stable climate. And that to me as a journalist was really a cue to, my whole practice theoretically is about getting to the roots of things, getting past what people are saying, whether it's the Secretary General or a skeptic or whoever. And I found that stepping back and thinking, well, what do we know about the hazard? How much it's changing? how much it changed in the past. Thinking about what's when we use a word like extreme or unprecedented, what's the basis for that? Since when? How?
Yeah, and this actually points to the way I start the book. Actually, I point back to a paper that I wrote back in 2011. I used this framing of climate reductionism, and argued against the dangers of reducing the future to climate. Yes, climate climates always change. We know that naturally. Humans are now intervening in ways that are changing that climate in rather dramatic ways. But climate is not the only thing that's changing today or in the future. And if we think of the future only through the lens of a changing climate, we've actually missed half of the crucial risk equation. Because what's also changing is human culture, human technology, human values, distribution of wealth, power, and life chances in the world, medical technology, artificial intelligence. Everything else that humans are immersed in is also changing at the same time that climate is changing. And if we think of this in risk terms, or as I would argue also in a more holistic geographical way, we need to pay just as much attention to these non-climatic changes that are taking place as we pay attention to the changing climatic hazards. And this is how I actually start the book,
right?
By pointing out this is what I was writing about 10, 11, 12 years ago. And it leads me to develop a rather more direct argument in this new book. It's not just climate reductionism about the future. What is concerning me is that the present now is being reduced simply to this one goal of arresting climate change at a particular numerical level, whether it's a global temperature target or a derivative of that, which is the whole net zero framing. I'm not saying at all that those things do not matter. We should be seeking ways of arresting the extent of human interference in the climate system. But if we reduce the politics of the present simply to that one goal, we actually are going to be missing out on a lot of other associated welfare and ecological goals that we should be putting into play. And I developed this through a series of chapters, partly deconstructing the way in which science has foregrounded global temperature as the thing that really matters. And I take a little diversion actually into warning against some of the blind alleys and evasions that scientists can fall into if they actually see themselves as the center of the story here. And then I point out in more broader terms, why this sort of reductionism is so alluring. Why has it become center stage over the last 10 or 20 years? But also some of the dangers of that framing, and then finish with some sort of counter frames that try to prick some of the hubris that at times I feel circulates around the science of this.
Yeah, boy. And the book has just come out, right? Is it out in both the Britain and the UK? In the US?
It came out in the UK 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think it comes out in the US at the end of August.
That's great. Well, it's the kind of book that, though, well, we'll talk about this in a minute, can be misperceived without actually, reading through it. So that's why I'm here with you. We'll talk about some of that tension that's in the book publishing industry these days too. I mean, the title is "Climate Change Isn't Everything," and you know how much that could be quickly propagated in ways that probably aren't what you hope for. But we'll talk about that. So let's talk about the origin story here a little bit. I'm showing folks the two initial chapter themes. Where did this come from? How did a belief of climate being the keystone lever to work on come about? And clearly the 2018 IPCC report played a role, and also the media around it.
Yeah, I maybe pushing it back. I mean, I actually think the Paris Agreement was actually quite instrumental here as well, because what it did, it put 1.5 degrees into play. We can trace back through the discourse of climate change. I can remember back in, well, I mean, we can actually go right the way back if we want to into the 1970s. Bill Nordhaus, the American economist, who first started putting climate and economics together with energy systems, and he would talk about 2 degrees being a margin, a tolerance margin for humanity. But that began to pick off in the 1990s, and people, certainly in the EU, were very adamant about advancing a 2-degree warming target. What the Paris Agreement did, and most of the scientific activity, actually, I remember this because I was very much involved with this in the late 1990s and the 2000s and into the 2010s even. A lot of the science around thinking about pathways, future pathways, mitigation, adaptation, vulnerability was based around 2 degrees as the policy goal. What the Paris Agreement did, and it took a number of people in the community by surprise, was to put 1.5 into play. Right. And that triggered the IPCC to respond to the UN Framework Convention to commission a special report on 1.5, which came out in 2018. And on the back of that, I think this sense then that now that 1.5 was seen by some as being some new decisive cliff edge beyond which the world would turn very, very nasty, gave fuel to new social movements, new discourses, a new pathology or a new psychology of climatic fear and anxiety. And I think that, I've been around long enough to try to keep, my pulse on the public discourse of climate change. And I think there was definitely a change in this period, sort of 2016, 17, 18. And it's partly, my motivation to write the book was partly to try to take a little bit of the sting out of that discourse of endings, of cliff edges, of alarmism, of catastrophe, and say, look, these issues are really, really serious, but they need to be, approached in a slightly less melodramatic fashion. That was part of it, and I think you're right about how, and I thought long and hard about how to frame this in a way that try to operate in the space between alarmism and denial, and that space at times has become a very difficult space to operate in. The tendency is to gravitate towards one of those two poles. And what I'm trying to do in the book is carve out a bit of a space in between that recognizes the seriousness of the problems that we are confronted with, but not thinking that we are doomed, and certainly not to think that the world will start falling to pieces at 1.5 degrees.
Yeah. Well, you're taking me back to, I think, our first interaction as source and journalist was back in 2007, when I did a story. I'll bring it up here. Let's see, which got me pummeled, called "New Middle Stance Emerges in Debate Over Climate." This approach was most publicly laid out in an opinion article on BBC by Mike Hulme. Then at Tyndall, I found myself increasingly chastised by climate change campaigners. My public statements have not satisfied their thirst for environmental drama. And what happened to me at that point was I was accused of by some the blogosphere, the liberal blogosphere of the, implying there is a middle, and that it isn't that I was doing he says, she says. And I did sort of lump you in with folks like Bjorn Lomborg and others who were trying to kind of carve out a middle space by pointing at exaggeration. And it went on from there to become a very heated arena. Anyone who thinks the middle is safe somehow is missing the acrimony that seems to be reserved for those who try to point these kinds of things out.
Yeah, and that was the piece in 2007, and I got some blowback in the UK, certainly in the UK, for even daring to seek to turn the dial down just a fraction. And I'm sure I'll get something similar now. But I think the issues, for me, they're so important that I just see my role as offering at least a line of argumentation that does try to navigate between those two extremes,
Right.
to point out the dangers of blindly following an alarmist and a doomist narrative. And I'm sort of senior enough in my career to not worry too much about the implications of that. But I see it's my role as an educator. And actually, part of the shaping of the book also has partly been inspired by just my interactions with students here at Cambridge. I mean, I've been teaching environmental scientists or geographers, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds for quite a long time. And I definitely have seen over the last 5 or 6 years, the students that I'm teaching are coming with a darker view of the future, and a lot of that is triggered by these discourses of deadlinism, doomism, endings, and too late. And so just interacting with students, we have some interesting conversations about where their particular feelings and sentiments come from, and I try to provide an alternative perspective on this. Is that the future is always up for grabs. There's nothing determined about the future. And actually, your generation, if you're 19, 20, 21, your generation has got a huge role and influence to shape that future. The game is not over. The game is never over. And people, of good intent and great creativity, whether it's in technical innovation, whether it's finding grassroots social innovation on the ground, whether it's people going into politics, for goodness sake. Representative politics has got a rather dirty word, a dirty reputation in recent years. And actually, this is another concern of mine, listening to students who no longer seem to be as committed as previous generations to the basic tenets of a democratic form of polity. The argument is, well, climate change, we haven't the luxury to listen to our opponents. We haven't the luxury to debate the pros and the cons, the means and the ends. Climate change needs action now, and democracies are not well placed to do that. And so this also is part of my concern that some of these impulses seem to me dangerously eco-authoritarian, and that worries me.
Well, yeah, and the last time you were on the show with Naomi Oreskes and others, 3 years ago.
During COVID, I think.
Yeah, very much so. The early days, we were talking about beware what you ask for when you ask for a climate emergency declaration. There's several different lenses there. One is that it's if it's not a supported concept, but then there's also, do you want a government that can impose upon you decisions on energy that might be unjust to some folks, or maybe they'll actually the government would go with nuclear or just with BECCS, with burning billions of trees. And so could you just get at that climate emergency concept as part of this too?
Yes, and the emergency narrative, again, there was a huge big emergence of this after the Paris Agreement, particularly after the 2018 report. You can look at all of the polling and the discourse online about emergency rhetoric around climate change. It really took off around 2017, 2018. Before COVID, and actually, I was writing about the dangers of emergency declarations and what that does. It can have a chilling effect on politics. It can have a suppressing effect on liberties, civil liberties, and then along came COVID, and immediately, within the first few weeks, emergencies were declared, and we saw all of these things happening in the name of defeating a pandemic. I don't want to digress into the politics of COVID, but it did demonstrate to us whether or not that particular emergency declaration was valid for COVID. It demonstrated what the costs or can be of emergency declarations. And climate change is a slower burn issue. It's not like a pandemic, but nevertheless, emergency calls are out there from the UN and the Secretary General. Right through to local municipalities or universities making their own declarations of emergency. And so there are a number of things about this. I mean, first of all, with a slow burn issue like climate change, one question I always ask is, well, when is the emergency over? What would actually bring a climate emergency to an end? Because I can't see how, once you've declared a climate emergency, one can undeclare it. So therefore, we're offering our politicians to operate in a perpetual state of emergency, and that carries dangers. The other thing is simply about the practical implications of this. And I remember it was before the pandemic. It must have been in 2019, after a lot of these declarations, and quite a few local authorities here in the UK were declaring climate emergencies. City municipalities, country boroughs. And I met up with the chief executive here in Cambridge of the Cambridgeshire Authority, and her council, the elected representatives that declared a climate emergency. She was the executive civil servant in charge of this, and she had about a 2-hour conversation. What do I do with this? In practical terms, my council have called a climate emergency. How am I to change the day-to-day running of my council because we're now living in a climate emergency? We've got all the budget constraints, we've got all the demands and the priorities in our time, whether it's social welfare, whether it's educational policy, whether it's ensuring that new builds are there for social housing. What does a climate emergency do for the local politics? And she was really, really frustrated because she just felt that these were gestures that were being made by local politicians. So I think, on one hand, climate emergency declarations, they have rhetorical power and strength. But once you've declared them, and what more can you do? On the other hand, at a practical level of decision making, does it actually really change anything? And I'm not sure it does.
Right. So many questions there that could be the entire focus of a book. I want to get back to sort of breaking things down. So we kind of talked about the origin story, or at least the run up to it. And when you really look carefully at the IPCC reports, it still really presents a picture of rising emissions equals rising hazard. And there's a big sections of the IPCC that are on the social levers, the whole working group 2 section, which the media tend to, again, to my mind, miss. The climate history is there. If you really want to look for it, the idea that there's something novel about the most severe hurricanes hitting Florida or Bangladesh. There's something novel about it is when you look with a paleoclimatology lens is less supported, which gets you back to what are the social levers? Mm-hmm. And again, Bangladesh has shown powerfully you can drastically cut losses in today's cyclones, which presumably have some climate influence in them, but the death rates are just plummeted. So you talk about a really interesting concept here of the noble lie, which I think goes way back to Plato and Socrates, and the idea that there are some untruths or some exaggerations that are appropriate for their social value. And I was looking back at the history of that thinking, and it was so interesting because there's a distinction between parables and noble lies, where with a parable, the person, the audience receiving the information, kind of knows it's a story, but with a noble lie, it's actually a lie, and the intent is not for the person to know it. Or maybe on some level they might know. So can you talk a little bit about this, and what is the pull here? I've got some images here talking about the scenarios question, but what is the pull of the lie, both in terms of how communicators within the sciences and policy go there, and then what is, what's a counterpoint to that?
Yeah, so I use this idea of the noble lie as a way to point to, I guess, the political operating space now that climate science operates in, and obviously this has become much more politically charged over the last 20 years or so. If we go back to some of the early climate science around global warming in the 60s and the 70s, it was perhaps rather less so. The 80s, things began to heat up, both climatically speaking, of course, but also politically. But now we find climate science operating in a very, very highly charged political space. And the issue here is really, what do we expect of science? What do we see science as a form of knowledge, inquiry and production that is different and distinct, and it's got qualities that we recognize and value and treasure and need to defend? Or actually, are we simply seeing science as another political resource that can be mobilized in favor of any particular ideological position? And there's a long, not very pleasant tale here that we can go back into the history of certain areas of science where either explicit political ideologies have intervened, think Lysenko and genetics under Stalin's Soviet Russia, or think of the eugenics of the late 19th, early 20th century. And actually, I do make those points in this chapter, just to say, look, science is not immune from being corrupted. Now, I'm not saying that the climate science is corrupt. I make that very clear. However, around the edges, there are definitely, in my view, examples where decisions have been taken or judgments have been made that have, maybe for quite innocent reasons, and this is where the Nobel lie comes in the sake of a good cause. Shortcuts are taken, certain data or results might not be published that would normally be published. And I'm just sending a warning shot here against climate scientists and some of the communications around climate science, to say, just be careful, because otherwise we risk demeaning science and its great public value, if we think of it as no more than just another political resource that can be mobilized however which way we want it to be. And my experience of this, of course, is partly, goes back to the whole ClimateGate controversy that occurred at my old university at East Anglia back in 2009.
Yeah.
There was quite a seminal moment, a wake-up call, actually, for climate science at that point, to realize that climate scientists are now operating in a very, very charged, politically charged space, and it requires scientists to look carefully over their shoulder at what they're doing and what they're saying in private, because what was being said in private then came out in these emails. And of course, some of what was being said didn't look good. And actually, there were some definite shortcuts and suppressions that those emails revealed were going on. It didn't take away the basic physics of the greenhouse effect and the fact that humans are genuinely changing the climate system, but it didn't do, for 2 or 3 years after that, it didn't do climate science any favors at all. So that's what I'm trying to get at here, and just offer a couple of warning shots that if we really value and treasure the power of science as a form of inquiry, we mustn't let it fall victim to the ideological politics of the contemporary moment.
That's a big challenge, I think, because everyone wants to be in the center of the picture. The Nobel Peace Prize for the community certainly elevated that sense of scientists' roles, and journalists who choose to focus on these issues. Also, I kind of rode this story from my 1988 cover story forward, and it was only in 2006, like 18 years into my climate reporting, which is really about CO2, and did I really twist to look at the social and political geography, as you say, the geography of knowledge, and to start to report on that more. But that's when I probably lost a lot of my readers because, again, we like these narratives. They're simple. They fit, going back to the age of Plato and we like heroes and villains, which is another part of this mix. I wanted to play a comment that was recently made by Secretary General Guterres that I think kind of captures that part of this. That it's not just the role of science. There's this narrative in our heads that goes way back that there has to be a bad guy, and oh my gosh, it's these guys. So let's just listen to Secretary General Guterres.
All of this action must be global, it must be immediate, and it must start with the polluted heart of the climate crisis, the fossil fuel industry. Let's face facts. The problem is not simply fossil fuel emissions. It's fossil fuels, period. The solution is clear. The world must phase out fossil fuels in a just and equitable way, moving to leave oil, coal and gas in the ground where they belong, and massively boosting renewable investment in a just transition. Fossil fuel industry transition plans must be transformation plans that chart a company's move to clean energy and away from a product incompatible with human survival.
That line really caught my attention. He, like you and I, are from a world that developed all of the comforts that we now live with that insulate us from climate hazards, burning these fuels. And there's a big chunk of the world, countries like Ghana, for example, that have resource, and now we're demanding they not develop it even for their own sake, let alone for the global supply of gas and the like. Is this part of climatism? It's more like carbonism, but here it's even beyond carbonism because it's not just the emissions.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good example of as you say, seeking out the villains of the piece, and this is partly why I talk about climatism as an ideology, because in ideologies, ideologies are generally their ways of simplifying the world, providing a scaffold, a framework by which individual humans can interpret what actually is a very confusing and often bewildering flow of facts and experiences and events in the world. But an ideology allows one to fit those experiences and facts into a particular scaffold. And very often these scaffolds do have this binary, the Nietzschean, the good versus the evil. And climatism has this, and the Secretary General here, captures it. The enemy is the fossil fuel industry, and everyone. So it's the implication then that everyone who's not in the fossil fuel industry are on the side of the angels. Mm-hmm. and this is dangerous reductionism. And fossil fuels. You can trace back 200 years, let's say. Where are we now? 1823, maybe 250 years. The emergence of cheap coal initially, then later oil and then gas. People saw these at the time as amazing resources that could transform society in ways that benefited not everybody, but increasingly larger numbers of people around the world. And of course, if we look at the post-war acceleration, increasingly all parts of the world benefiting from cheap, reliable energy. Now, to cast that 250-year history as being, the devil incarnate is far too simplistic a narrative. People at the time were not thinking that this was a way to bring human civilization to an end. They were actually seeing this as a form of emancipation and growth and liberation. Now, okay, we now know, of course, that fossil fuels have dangerous side effects. And I've just recently been thinking, are we in a similar position just at the moment with artificial intelligence? The hype around at the moment, and yes, there are warning sirens from some people around this, but generally speaking, the mainstream narrative is that artificial intelligence will be transformative. It would allow societies to do things they could never dreamt of before. Now, maybe that's true. Maybe actually, we're on the cusp of a new era of emancipated humanity. Just as 250 years ago, the industrialists at the time would have said exactly the same thing. I worry just as much about the long-term implications of artificial intelligence, or some deployments of them, or some unforeseeable implications of them, as I would worry about civilization coming to an end because of climate change. So I think we have to be just a little bit careful about painting the fossil fuel industry purely in dark colors. What is it? 80%, 82% of the world's total primary energy is linked to coal, oil, and gas still.
Right.
Yes, it'd be great if we could reduce that to zero tomorrow or in 7 years' time. It's just not going to happen. Particularly in a world that still has got population growth down the pipeline, another 2 billion at least, and aspirations of at least 4 billion to enhance their life chances through improved energy services. So however rapidly we develop alternative fuels that are competitive, that are sustainable, that are clean, we still have got a future. And the kids that I'm teaching here at Cambridge, they're 20 years old. By the time they retire, fossil fuels will still be in the mix, although certainly much less proportionate than they are at the moment. So this is part of my framing here of climatism. And partly the allure of climatism. There are different elements to it, but certainly one of it is this Nietzschean worldview. If you're not with us, you're against us, and we can finger the enemy. And if we could eradicate the enemy, then we've got victory. That's an alluring narrative. It's a human story that we like to gravitate to.
Yeah, there was
climate change isn't like that.
There was a comment that came in from whoever G Moke is on YouTube. Beware of who you take as an enemy as you become like them. One good reason to avoid war metaphors. And I know Bill McKibben and others have used war. Well, Mike Mann, Bill McKibben have used the war metaphor many times. I wanted to transition a little bit. Do you have time to go a little bit beyond the turn of the hour?
Yeah, another 5 or 10 minutes at the most.
Okay. Then let's definitely get to the next phase here, which is what do we do about this? So we know that we're in a mode right now that doesn't really represent the problem, that has its own risks in terms of misappropriation of resources. I've done sessions here on maladaptation and malmitigation, what I call malmitigation, where you're actually harming lives through mitigation policies. So the question here is, I wanted to talk about the media role, but that's maybe another session we could do, because there's this amplification process that happens from the research abstract to the news release to the headline. And the media, and I've been part of this, we tend to zoom in on the aspects that fit our narrative. I had on here Martin van Alst, who's part of the World Weather Attribution process. And he said, everyone pays attention. The media are only listening to the part about carbon attribution. And we have a whole section in every one of our reports on the other drivers of impacts. And it's just that no one listens to it or pays attention to it. So the media are part of this. And then let's just get to, you have a section on objections, and you talk about, well, you sound just like you do worry about being perceived as someone who's maybe less than honorable in how they approach this. And there are lots of books out there. Steve Koonin, former Obama Energy Department official, he's focused on the uncertainty. I did a conversation with Bjorn Lomborg with the super popular Lex Friedman podcast, and one thing I complained about was the title of his book, which I think can really convey the wrong answer. Judith Curry is a very good climate scientist who I've long respected, but now she's being appropriated by Jordan Peterson and others as a source of it's all hooey. And this we touched on this very briefly, but going forward, what would success look like? Is it a matter of a whole heap of new people reading your book and saying, oh, there's this other way to approach this, or how does this work?
Yeah, what does success look like? I mean, all I can do is drop my pebble in the pond. The book may just sink like a pebble in the pond without leaving very many ripples at all. I don't have any huge pretensions about this, but on the other hand, I've been around this issue for a long time. And I've thought about it from lots of different angles, from the science, from the social science, from the politics, from the cultural human values side of things. And, I just have to tell it how I see it. And I would like to think that at least some of the arguments in the book resonate. I mean, people may not buy the whole book, but I think I've spoken to enough people informally, and had a handful of reviews just come in the last two or 3 weeks from people to sense that actually at least parts of this will resonate with some of their mild concern, or more than mild concern, about just the way in which the discourse, the rhetoric, and the framing of climate change has evolved in recent years. Whether it's people's concern about the impacts of this on young people. I've had a couple of people that I know in the development community who say, yeah, exactly. Climate change is not everything when it comes to development practitioners, or people who are in the innovation business, technology innovation business, who they see climate change as a really serious issue, but they're on the side of finding solutions. They're not part of the enemy. Whether you're taking money from Shell or BP in order to find better ways of sequestering carbon, or finding better ways of transmitting electricity securely from large solar plants or wind plants, these people are on the side of solutions, and they don't like being cast as allies of the devil. So I know that there are people out there who maybe can't quite put their finger on why they're slightly disquiet about the framing of climate change at the moment, but I hope this book at least gives them one or two entry points to better articulate maybe why they do feel the way that they do.
There's a question that came in. Maybe this is a good place to come toward a close. Cassie Grether on Facebook asks, I teach earth science where we cover climate change. What would you say is the most important takeaway to teach students?
Is to do good earth science, earth system science. To understand certainly, the interplay between different physical systems and human systems, and how human systems can shape those physical systems. If you're teaching science, the take-home message is to do good science, and go where that science leads you. It may be willing to challenge, received orthodoxies. The whole tipping point question has gone back and forth a lot of times since it was first put into play by John Schellnhuber and Tim Lenton and others in the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006. So we've had moments when tipping points are everywhere, and then scientific papers finding that actually maybe those tipping points are less sensitive, and then we've got a new one coming along. Actually, the science of tipping points in the Earth system is all over the place. And yet, if you listen to some of the discourse about climate change and tipping points, then these things are just waiting to leap out and grab us and destroy us in the next few years. We need better science, and realizing that the understanding a complex, dynamic, nonlinear, chaotic Earth system is actually not trivial. And this is where a little bit of humility. I talk about humility as part of the way of providing an antidote to climatism, a bit of humility about what science can predict about the future, and with what degrees of confidence and certainty.
Right.
So that's a good lesson for science students as well, is to recognize the sources of uncertainty, particularly around predictions of the future, and be upfront and open about those sources of uncertainty.
My personally, I would say the thing that I've learned and I've done in my own head, I just recently taught some students who are gathered at the New York Times, where I used to work, to study climate journalism. I said, just do the mental exercise of distinguishing between climate change, a change in the system, and climate risk. Because the thing that societies care about is risk, theoretically. Who is at risk? Why are they at risk? And if you start to do that, you start to see very quickly this landscape of the geography of who's exposed to hazards and vulnerable is very different with or without climate change. Climate change is exacerbating many of those risks. So just thinking about risk and putting that in the foreground, especially in an inquiry-based way, have students look at an example, whether it's wildfire. And you look at California, look at how many homes have been built in areas prone to fire, and the rate of change in that vastly exceeds the rate of change in some factor that is in the climate system itself.
Yeah, and I think another example of that is, and again, using the risk framework I use in the book, actually, is this this idea of putting risks alongside each other. So, you can look at 200 or 300 million Indians who still cook on open stoves with wood burning.
Right.
So the risk for them is actually a health risk, direct, immediate indoor particulates that are devastating on human health. So a much cleaner fuel is to move to gasoline and diesel fuel. It emits CO2, but in the household it's clean. So if you think that the only thing that matters is eradicating fossil carbon from the system, you will not invest in those sorts of clean gasoline fuels, and you actually condemn people to continuing with a different risk, the risk of immediate health impacts because of air pollution. So risk also is a useful way of at least juxtaposing different types of risks alongside each other. And of course, people will evaluate those in different ways. Not everybody will evaluate risks and comparative risks in the same way that you do.
Right.
So that also is a good insight.
Well, and as you say, that also opens up the space. That opens the space for dialogue. That we live on a planet and we live in countries where, if the voices of those at risk are not really considered, you can end up with both mal-mitigation and mal-adaptation. You can end up with policies that are actually harming people who are the most vulnerable. Mike, it's great to have you on the show. I'd love to do a follow-up because we just scratched the surface here, really, of what's possible. But it is the end of your day there in England. You probably have more to do here in the summer. And I just hope everyone can take a look at the book. Go to mikehume.org. There's the website, and you can explore some of the essays. I think there, if you go there, you'll also see an extract from the book that gets at some of the core concepts.
And it comes out in the States, I think, at the end of August.
Good. So maybe that's when we can come back and dig a little deeper. Again, Mike Hulme, you've been a long time guide to my reporting, and back in the day, my wife actually separately has the book "Why We Disagree About Climate Change." She was a climate education sustainability.
But hopefully you disagree with your wife, then, do you?
Oh, we do on nuclear power. We do, and see, that's the thing. We didn't really get into the area of steps going forward, but one of them is being comfortable with response diversity. That there is no single answer here, and that dialogue is important. I have a slide here I'll just show. And Thomas Elmquist, who's written about response diversity in ecosystems, he and others have a new paper out, Response Diversity as a Sustainability Strategy, which is like the antithesis of climatism, which is very much a truncated one-way street into this process. So we need Greta, we need Bill Gates, we need everybody, and it's not easy. So thanks again for your time, Mike Hulme, Cambridge University. The book again is Climate Change Isn't Everything. It's really important, especially on long time scales. And this is Andy Revkin, Sustain What webcast. This is my last iteration of this webcast as an officer at Columbia University. I'm leaving Columbia Climate School in about a week or two and becoming more independent. Partially because I live in Maine, partially because the climate school is evolving. I still think there's a vital role for open conversation around these issues. Sustain what is my daily question. Don't yell sustainability, say sustain what, how, for whom, and you're starting to make progress. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you very much, Andy. Appreciated the conversation. Thank you.
Take care.